Once again, Atlanta joins the nation in its struggle for a fair and equitable society. The city was a focal point during last summer's social upheaval in response to the George Floyd murder and continued mistreatment of black people.
We gotta send a message to Minnesota. And we gotta send a message to the White House.
Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms was instrumental in bringing a sense of order to what could have escalated into a long period of violence. But now it appears Atlanta will be under new leadership. We recently spoke to Mayor Bottoms about whether Atlanta will continue to be in the forefront of the struggle for equality. Welcome back to Crucial Conversations from the stage of the historic Rialto Center for the Arts in downtown Atlanta. I'm Doug Blackmon. In this episode, I'm joined by two Georgia State University students who've worked as associate producers on earlier episodes of our program. Kim Ford, who in addition to her graduate studies at Georgia State, is already a successful entrepreneur, author, and media personality. And Mark LANNAMAN, a senior journalism student currently working on a documentary about gentrification in Atlanta. And our special guest, who needs little introduction, is Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. She is a former prosecutor, magistrate judge, and defense attorney. She served most of a decade on the city council, then was elected mayor in 2017. Mayor Bottoms, this is the sixth of these conversations that we put together on the stage over the past year. And what we'd like to do in this conversation is to walk back through some of the big issues that we've discussed in prior shows. And one of those, most obvious ones, is that it's now been a year since the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations in Atlanta in 2020. And we'd like to talk with you about how you see the city today and what has changed, what has not. I was just looking back at the dates and saw that it was, I believe, May the 25th that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then just a couple of weeks later that Rayshard Brooks was killed in Atlanta. Can you give us just a broad sense of where you see the state of the city now and the progress that's been made, or maybe the things that remain most important to you to see done?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's great to join Mark and Kim as well for this discussion. This year has changed all of us, and our city has been no different. There has been an awakening that has not been experienced, I believe, in my lifetime. And to see what happened last summer and to witness people across America of all races pour out into our streets, and not for one day, not for 2 days, but for a sustained period of time calling for justice, I don't think that we will ever be the same again. And just the ability and the fact that we are openly having these conversations was not the case even in April of last year. The fact that there are people listening and there are people speaking their truth, it's refreshing in so many ways, but it's also tragic in so many other ways. Because I was born just at the end of the civil rights movement in America, and I didn't think in my lifetime that we would again be the center of another movement like that. But clearly it was needed. And shame on us if we are ever the same again. Going back to last year, the irony of where we found ourselves in this city at the center of attention with the shooting of Mr. Brooks was that just a few weeks before, President Obama had issued a challenge to mayors and cities across America to go back and look at 21st century police reforms that had come out under the Obama-Biden administration. So we accepted the challenge. We had convened an advisory council to take a look at our existing policies, and within a matter of days, Mr. Brooks was killed. And what was most disappointing was that here we were with all that was happening in America. We were trying to get in front of issues like this, and then to find ourselves in the center of it was unexpected and disappointing in so many ways. But what I am proud of is that even in the midst of all that we faced last summer, the work continued. The recommendations from the Advisory Commission still went forward, and many of the reforms have already been enacted, and those recommendations that have not been enacted are in the process of being enacted. So, for example, creating a repository so that when people use their cell phone to get footage of an incident, we're creating a public database where people can upload that information. We adopted the 8 Can't Wait platform. But what last summer said to me as a leader and to all of us is we can't move fast enough. There's still so much work to be done. Dealing with the challenges of last summer while also trying to move the needle was very difficult, but the work continued, and I'm proud that as a city we were able to do that.
Yeah, Mark, you were talking earlier, saying something actually very similar what the mayor said a second ago, of that the way that the events of last summer, I think you used the word mainstreamed, issues that hadn't been before. But yeah, tell us about that.
Well, what I saw last summer is I felt like almost before last summer, Black Lives Matter and things like that had almost been taboo in a sense to say, and it wasn't as mainstream or as accepted widely. And because of the protests and because of, as you said, everybody kind of joining together for this cause, it became something that was widely accepted, and it opened up these conversations, like even the ones we're having now. Kind of to your point, I thought it was something beautiful. And if it's okay, I wanted to ask you, did you almost feel like there was a responsibility as the mayor of Atlanta, or just as a city as a whole, to kind of be at the forefront before the Rayshard Brooks killings? Did you feel that responsibility to kind of take action and be leaders around the country?
We did, and I felt a personal responsibility because it's who Atlanta is. So growing up in this city, it's in your DNA that there's this responsibility to be responsible. And that was the reason we had publicly accepted the challenge from President Obama, and we were so excited and eager about the work. And then it took such a somber tone where we thought we were getting ahead of something. Then we almost found ourselves chasing it in a way. It's who we are as a city. You know, we never asked for these moments in our city, but when they happen, we've always risen to the occasion. And that's a responsibility that I always feel, but especially so last summer.
I heard when you came out there near the CNN Center and you kind of gave your family's history and how much the city has meant to you, and how you kind of, you really stepped up as a leader, and I thought that was the right thing to do as a mayor. So, on behalf of all of us, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. These moments, we don't script history, but just to see young people out at the CNN Center, and you saw the range of emotion, you saw the anger, you saw the hurt, you saw the pain, you saw the sadness. It was all there in that moment.
This community right over here used to be a Black community called Lightning. It is where my great-grandmother's house stood. And I've been thinking about my family's history in this city a lot the past week. My grandmother's grandparents came from a plantation in Crawfordsville, Georgia. They were freed slaves. And what I've been asking myself repeatedly is how my grandmother's grandfather, a freed slave, could find forgiveness in his heart, and how he could believe that there was something better for his children's children and generations to come. So I stand here today, the 60th mayor of Atlanta, the direct descendants of slaves in this state, because my forefathers believed that there was something better on the other side. And what I'm saying to you all today, there is something better on the other side of this. There's something better on the other side of this for us, and there's something better on the other side of this for our children's children.
Kim, you've talked about the sort of signature moment of the mayor, of the press conference that you gave a little bit after that moment you were just describing, where Killer Mike was there and it was carried nationally and so many people watched it. And Kim, you were talking earlier about your reaction to the mayor in that moment.
Yeah, I thought you gave an amazing response to that. You was the mother that the city needed. You know, you were bigger than the mayor. This was bigger than you just being the mayor, because so many people were hurting. They needed direction, they needed guidance, because their emotions, rightfully so, were all over the place. And me being a mom, I felt that. You needed to tell them, go home, because we really care for our people that's out there. And we know, we had some bad actors that may have been doing some things, but for the most part, when you really love your city, there's certain things you're just not gonna destroy. And I understood that, so I wanted to applaud you for, coming out boldly as a mother that they needed to say, go home, and brought all allies with you to reinforce that.
Well, I appreciate that. And, again, we don't script these moments. That night, my then 18-year-old was in the room with me. And I was as much speaking to him as I was everyone else, and also thinking about parents whose children perhaps were out. Mm-hmm. It was also this plea, call your child and ask them to come home, because the backstory of that, we were in the Joint Operation Command Center, so there are cameras up around the city and we're looking at screens. And I knew the police officers were beyond exhausted at that point. Turn on the television, I said, this doesn't look right.
Right.
You could feel it and you could see it, and you could tell we were getting toward a tipping point.
But it was just the challenge of, as a leader, navigating all of these different things. And there were some people who reacted to your comments that night at the press conference as that, well, that maybe you were being too hard on the protesters, they're a little too hard, too African-American mother, as Killer Mike called it a few minutes later, I think, a little too harsh. But yeah, maybe you could just talk about that, the struggle of that there are so many different interests and backgrounds at play at once, and how to navigate through that in the moment, but then also how to put things back together again afterwards.
So that night was such an interesting night, and even as we were gathering the Joint Operation Command Center, there were people who were coming in, many of whom haven't traditionally been fans of mine, who organized protests quite a bit in the city, and they were saying, we don't know what this is. So we knew we had something bigger. I said to someone on our team, let's get T.I. down here. T.I. actually brought Killer Mike because Killer Mike wasn't coming. We laugh about that now. He came, and then someone called Bernice King and Jill Beasley, and people were just converging on the center. I just remember this moment looking around at the panic on a number of people's faces, and I knew that I had to say something. And that's when I walked out, and I didn't know what I was going to say, and I didn't remember what I had said, but I had so many emotions. You're standing there as mayor, but I'm a mother, first and foremost, and as someone who loves this city. And I remember when I was done speaking, stepping back and going, either that went really right or it went really wrong.
We are in the midst of a movement in this country, but it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to be able to get together and articulate more than our anger.
And I did get criticism, and I even heard some people say that I was afraid that Black people were going to look bad in front of white people, that we were embarrassing ourselves. It was, the takes were very interesting, but at the end of the day, it was just about my love for Atlanta and the emotion I felt with my son who wanted to be there. And I said, well, just please come with me and see what happens on the other side of it. And I was shocked that he agreed to come, but I wanted him with me because I wanted to keep my eyes on him, because I was afraid that when I left the house, he was gonna leave right behind me. And I knew how volatile and how quickly things could change, which was why I had called him the day before. Like, you know, just come home.
One of the things that night jumped out at me when you were talking, I still remember exactly as you were saying it, that at one point, one of your lines, you said that this isn't, we don't have this problem in Atlanta, something close to that. When I think you were referring to the kind of police brutality, the sort of over-response that had happened with George Floyd. And then when 2 weeks later, the Rayshard Brooks case happened, that jumped into my head of, wow, that's a, and I could detect, and I think maybe the next time I saw you talking, that you know that was a gut punch. I think I don't know if you connected it back to that line or not. Yeah, it's one thing to get through the crisis. It's another thing to reweave the fabric of the city and these relationships with the police, and also what Kim was talking about earlier of how different kinds of people have different needs at different times, and who ought to be there from officialdom, from society to help them. But tell us about what happened with you, Kim.
Yeah, I'm a resident of Buckhead. I've lived there for at least the last 15 years or so. And I came home one day and there was a man sitting at my front door. And it immediately startled me. I had a handful of groceries and I walked up and for 2 seconds, I thought he was my son. My son is 15. I said, no, he's inside in virtual school. Who is this man? And so I said, are you okay? And he looked up, his eyes was just bloodshot red. He said, yes, I've just been walking a whole lot. So immediately, I didn't know whether to call the police or is this a different situation. So as soon as he said, I've just been walking a lot, I said, okay, this man must be homeless. So again, my son is inside, I didn't know what to do. I really didn't want to call 911 because that could turn into something totally different. So I was torn. So I just let him stay there. And eventually he did leave, but he kept coming back again and again, to the point to where I did have to call the police. And that 911 call that I made to the police, I said, God, please don't let this end up being a tragedy when I'm just trying to keep my home safe. So my question is, will there be like a protocol maybe to where we can call, instead of 911, some other number of someone that can really assist that person and get them some help? And the police did come out and they were, you know, very nice. He said, sir, you're not in trouble. That was the very first thing he said, but you cannot be here. This is private property. And so he eventually got up and left, but I really don't like my first inclination of why do we have to double, you know, think before we call 911. So I wanted to know, is there a certain protocol maybe of a different type of number we could call for different types of help?
Well, actually, there is, and I'm so glad to hear that was handled appropriately from our side, and the appropriate response and resolution was received on your side. I'm glad to hear that. But to answer your question, we're trying a pilot project now to do just that, to help people not call 911 in those situations, but to instead call 311. And when they call 311, then we will send out the appropriate team, crisis intervention team, if it's someone who needs housing or a situation like you described, because there's so many other ways that we can deal with people who are in need, because it was beyond him possibly trespassing on your property. Very likely, he may have been experiencing homelessness or some type of mental health crisis. And so with this pilot project, we are making sure that we have the teams in place who can respond, provide those services, and then at some point we will extend it. Right now we are doing it in 3 zones in the city, I believe it's 3. and with anticipation of expanding it throughout the city once we make sure it's going as it should.
So, Mark, you had a story about an encounter you had, I think, relatively recently with a police officer. The reaction that you had was interesting to hear, and it seemed to say something about the things we're talking about.
Right, absolutely. It was maybe a few months ago. I just went to the top of a parking deck because the views tend to be nice. And I was just in my car, and then I saw a police officer come, and I guess he was just wondering what I was doing or something. So he was just kind of coming with an inquisitive nature, or maybe he was in the area, I'm not sure. But immediately, I'm tensing up because I'm at the top of this parking deck alone, and I'm like, oh man, it probably doesn't look good. So, hands on the dash, roll down the window, and I just kind of lock up. And when he approached me, he was like, whoa, there's no need for all that. Just, relax, it's nothing. And, it just, to me, it was like, I don't think you understand. I can't feel relaxed. I don't think you are a bad person. I don't really know you, but I'm not gonna take that risk and just, flail or anything like that. So I had to be on best behavior. And so I think that's something a lot of us can relate to. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I do think that's something that a lot of us, we've had similar stories like that.
Just a few weeks ago, there was a chase I live in Grant Park, and it was actually a Georgia State Police chase, because I know Atlanta has a policy against these high-speed chases in most circumstances in the city limits. But I heard sirens off in the distance, and you can sort of tell when you're hearing this kind of thing. And they were getting louder and louder, coming really fast toward us. And then all of a sudden, look out the front window of the house, and this car comes by, super high speed down our block, state trooper right behind him. And then the guy trying to escape tries to make a turn and can't make it and crashes into a car, goes up onto the sidewalk, bangs into another car. Later learned that this was the person driving that car had just shot a couple of people in a Zestos on Moreland, so like 2 weeks ago. But there were a couple of remarkable things about that. One was the chase part, was a little unnerving. But I went outside, I walked up the street where the officer had stopped, and there was a crowd of people coming out, watching what was happening. But it was all white folks, and Grant Park's a diverse area. But this group, 20 or 30 white people kind of coming out of their houses. And I thought to myself, actually, that I wonder if this scene would be any different and it was a white officer, a white trooper. And so here's this white law enforcement officer and a group of white people. And there wasn't I didn't detect any sense of kind of fear on anybody's part there. And I just wondered if the crowd was black, would it have felt any different? And so, like, the officer that you were dealing with, was that a white officer or a black officer?
From what I could tell, he was white. He wasn't black, I know.
Yeah, so. Yeah. So, but yeah, all of this sort of gets at the, I don't know, the fact that I'm thinking about that even, and the fact that you have the anxiety that you do, does speak to this kind of broken relationship that a lot of people, I think, feel about the police. What's your reaction to those sorts of things?
I understand it. It's unfortunate. But the reality is Black people have a much higher likelihood of being killed by the police. That's reality. But the other reality that's not spoken of, especially in Atlanta, by and large, we have men and women who show up every single day wanting to make it home safely to their families, and also having respect and regard for our communities. Many of our officers grew up in Atlanta. So many of them are part of the communities that they grew up in. That was likely what I was thinking of when I made that reference. Mm-hmm. But obviously, even under the best circumstances, things can go wrong. And I'm so glad that you had a positive encounter. And by and large, men and women have positive encounters with police officers each and every day, but those encounters don't make the news. But unfortunately, it seems as if every single day we are waking up to another tragedy in this country. And it just makes me sick to my stomach.
I would agree with that. My son he's 15. It's time for him to start learning how to drive, and I'm trying to put it off as long as possible, but he's like, no, Mom, it's time for me. And I don't like having that concern of my hesitation. I know typically probably a white mother doesn't have a second thought about it. Yeah, it's time. Go ahead and get your license. Go ahead and, But for me, I do have that reservation.
And my husband and I were just having this conversation. It's not that white people in America don't have encounters with police officers. It's not that they don't resist or arrest, or they don't try and run away, or they don't drive drunk, or in any number of things. But somehow those encounters just don't seem to turn out the same way. We've got so much work to do, and it's unfortunate that these incidents that seem to repeatedly make the news are overshadowing the men and women who do their job with the highest of integrity and responsibility.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. In the beginning, the question was, are these things happening at a higher and higher level, more and more frequency, or is it just that there's a camera in everybody's hand now and we're seeing the evidence of it? And I think that's still a little bit of a question of which it is. But it's also the case that I know that when going even further back to the Ferguson and this longer period of time, one thing I do want to ask, what you were saying just a second ago about all the good cops and the hard work that they do and the dangers that they face, all those very real things. I think it's true. I think this number is correct. That there is a number that like the percentage of police officers who never fire their service weapon in their entire careers is very high. Very high percentage of officers never unholster their weapon in the line of duty. So that is, we now may have as you were saying, outsized. We have the sense that there's even more of these sorts of things happening than there are, than particularly the most extreme ones. But this contact, the routine contact, the nature of the routine contact between citizens and police does seem complicated. There were the 4 officers who were fired in Atlanta after the incident in which they roughly treated some students from the Atlanta University Center during the protests last summer. But then recently they were reinstated, or they appealed their firings and were reinstated under the kind of procedural questions about how that's handled. Recently, in the Rayshard Brooks case, the officer there, even though he's under charges for that killing, he's also going through the process of seeking to get his job back. And if I read it correctly, the assistant police chief of APD last week, or in this hearing, testified that he had not violated policy in that shooting. I'm not sure what you can say about any of that, but in terms of the complexity of addressing any of these issues in the midst of so many levels of interests at play and rules that are at play, but just the challenge of all that and the challenge of police morale in the midst of it. How do you pursue the problem things without completely without leaving all the rest of the officers with a sense that nobody backs them up anymore?
Yeah, it's tough. And as a leader, you make the best decision that you know to make. And as Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. But in that moment, that was the decision that I felt needed to be made for our city. I sat and I watched both those incidents frame by frame by frame by frame. And given where we were and how volatile our streets were at that time, we were under the most extreme of circumstances at that time. And I firmly believe, had I not made that decision, that for as tough as last summer was, I think it would have been far worse in Atlanta. And the irony of it, May 29th, I remember talking with an officer in police headquarters and him saying to me, no mayor has ever respected us and regarded us the way that you have. And they were calling me the public safety mayor because we had given our officers a 30% pay increase. And the reason that I pushed forward with that pay increase was because they deserved it. And we didn't want fatigued officers working three jobs to make ends meet, and want them to be able to live in our city and be a part of our community. And the officers, the police union didn't support me in my last race, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The respect and regard that I have remains, but having respect and regard for our officers and also holding them accountable, it's not mutually exclusive. So there is healing that has to happen. Morale is down not just with our police department, but across the country. People are leaving public safety because they are frustrated, and people want jobs usually where people respect what they do. So it's been tough here, but it's been tough across the country. But we will get to the other side of it because we are a resilient city and we are a resilient nation, but it's not going to be easy.
Well, let's move on to some other things that we've talked about on this program before. We did a whole episode on the controversy over the Chattahoochee brick site, which for those who aren't familiar with that, but this place on the edge of Atlanta at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, where there were over 30 years, there were thousands of African-American men and some women compelled to work there through the criminal justice system under really horrifying circumstances in this Dickensian brick factory. Lots of people died, starvation, no health care. I mean, it was sort of all of the worst things you can possibly imagine, long after slavery was supposed to have ended. And then the biggest irony of all, of course, is that the person who owned that place and profited from it was one of your predecessors as the mayor of Atlanta. So we did an episode about that because of the controversy that developed when Norfolk Southern Railway proposed to build a new industrial facility on this long abandoned 70 acres of land. And then suddenly you intervened through the city and took a position that the city was going to oppose all that. Why does it really matter? I mean, yes, this terrible thing happened, but it's just a big vacant piece of property. And why not just let some useful purpose come to a place like that?
So first of all, thank you for educating me. I read your book, Slavery by Another Name, many years ago. But to answer your question, history matters. And when I read your book, that had to have been at least 10 years ago, if not more. I didn't know that part of our history. And so many of us were only educated because you told the stories. And then you think about this site, this is the physical place where so much of this happened. And so I'm grateful that Norfolk Southern made the decision that they did. And now the work continues. How will we memorialize this site? And it's important because people don't know that this use of prison labor and so much of what's been built around our city and so many leaders of our city were a part of this and led this and were complicit in this. And the opportunity for us to memorialize these men and women at this site is an opportunity that we often don't get in Atlanta because so much of our history has been torn down or was burned down. And this is an opportunity for us to do it on that site. And I do hope our discussions will continue and they will be productive and we'll have the opportunity to do what's right by the men and women who died there.
Well, I'm curious what you guys think, because when I talk about those events and related things to students, I'm never quite sure what reaction I'll get, even from African-American students. The cliche assumption would be that, oh, the African-American kids will be up in arms about this, will immediately see how terrible this history is, because there were lots of places like Chattahoochee Brick, not just in Atlanta and Georgia, but all over the South. But some students have a reaction more like the question that I asked you a minute ago, of kind of, well, it was 100 years ago, it was 130 years ago. Why does it really matter? Why do we have to keep kind of swimming around in these bad things, these bad feelings? And I kind of get that, but it still surprises me. But yeah, what do you guys think?
Well, I think it matters because we have to acknowledge, as you said, when you know better, do better. So we have to acknowledge our mistakes of the past, to build on a site like that and just kind of say, well, it's in the past. Oh, well, that kind of negates everything that just happened. And especially when you think about it and kind of juxtapose it with, we have Confederate monuments, as far as I'm from Kennesaw, so there's a lot of those. And, you see that everywhere and you see people honoring, these soldiers and whatnot, your history, but then we want to build on top of these people who were wronged so terribly. And so, I think it's a great thing when we have an opportunity to do better, why not? It's not just about, oh, it's an empty piece of land. No, it's legacies on that land, so.
I would agree too, and it's important to know that history tends to repeat itself. And if we don't know that history, it's going to repeat itself in some type of way. So one, I would say, why isn't that in the history books? You know, my daughter went through Atlanta Public Schools. My son is currently in Atlanta Public Schools, and I definitely don't remember that story of, you know, of them learning that or coming to talk about that at all. So in addition to that, thank you again for for even writing the book, for letting the world know, and it needs to be talked about even more so. But why should we care? Because that's our ancestors. That's just like our ancestor that's jumped off the slave ships on the way here. It's the exact same thing, in my opinion. And it will repeat itself if we don't know why it's there and how do we stop the people that's in positions to allow these things to keep happening. We have to remove those and the systemic racism that allowed that.
Might I add, it's not just unique to Atlanta, and because, you know, as we said, if we don't tell this story, we're going to forget about it. I remember when we were doing this show, I was looking for some research, and we found the Sugarland 95. You know, I believe it was in Texas. So I'm sure, you know, these aren't just isolated incidents. You know, these can probably be found all over the country. And so it's at least a start when we start saying, yeah, we're going to memorialize our history. And it's not just, you know, Black people's, it's everybody's history. You know, we should all kind of say these people were horribly wronged, I think at least. So definitely, as you said, we don't learn about this stuff enough, but we need to start doing it.
And I think even more so for those that are not white to understand why we have the right to be upset in so many ways. When people that are not white, especially white people, really know the depth of what their ancestors did, maybe it will be a little bit more sensitive to why we say the things we say now or do the things we do now, instead of, oh, what's the big deal? Why are they just so angry? Well, let's take it back to what your ancestors did. That's why we should care, and that's why we have to over-communicate what happened and what needs to be done next.
And that's what brings us right back to Black Lives Matter. You know, this sort of long history that's about lots of things other than, you know, police stops and things like that. That was my big lesson from writing that book, was just when it hit me that just how, as somebody who thought I already knew most of these things, but just the scale of the injuries. And because I could take you to a half dozen places in Metro Atlanta that were just as terrible as Chattahoochee Brick. I could take you to 100 places across Georgia and a couple of other states. And there are hundreds of others that I know they existed, but that we would never be able to find them. Wow. But, you know, the width and the breadth and the scale of it all is really...
And even growing up in Atlanta, I had never heard the story either. And I think there's a tendency in the African-American community, we don't often repeat our hurt. We tuck it away, as many people do who have experienced trauma. We don't like to keep reliving that trauma. And my mother went to English Avenue Elementary School. And
Named after Mayor English, right.
So, you know, it's so much a part of our history, yet it's not a part of our history because it's never been spoken and repeated.
Atlanta has these terrible dimensions of its past, also, and it has had these very recent struggles that we've been talking about. But it does have this glorious recent history as a place that arguably, I would say, Atlanta is perhaps the most important place in America in terms of innovative thinking in the last 50, 60 years about how this society should evolve from the kind of apartheid version of it that existed before we were born into the still troubled, still flawed, but the vastly more equitable version of it that we have today. Now, going forward, is Atlanta still that? Is Atlanta still the source of that kind of innovation and creative thinking and about the most important issues that speak to equity and diversity and such? Are we still generating the solutions to some of those things like Maynard Jackson and affirmative action and contracting and, you know, all these really specific things that came out of Atlanta that changed the course of American history on these things? But what do you think? Are we still playing that role?
We certainly think that we are. You know, there's a great company in Atlanta, and they make these shirts that says Atlanta influences everything. And I do believe that is still true, whether it's the cultural influence, the intellectual influence with the Atlanta University Center and our other great institutions like Georgia state, and still this legacy of civil and human rights, we very much are looked to lead on any number of issues, whether it is police and justice reform, whether it is how we respond to COVID as a blue city in a red state. And you go down the list, whether it's bringing tech companies here, or what Ambassador Young likes to call the Atlanta way, where we combine commerce with compassion. No other city does it the way we do it in Atlanta, still. And even when we talk about redevelopment projects in this city and saying you have to have affordable housing, and we're going to create an affordable housing trust fund, and we are also going to have a job training component of this, and the list goes on, and having companies and partners who are saying, I get it. And I hear CEOs say all of the time that they don't experience it in the way it's experienced in Atlanta. And when we attract businesses to our city, many of our CEOs take the other CEO out and have a heart-to-heart conversation, I understand, on what the expectations are when you are a part of this city. So we don't always get it right, but we do a whole lot better than anybody else, any other city that I know.
Gentrification is something that people talk about a lot in Atlanta. I often think that when we talk about gentrification, it's not always 100% clear exactly what we're talking about. It's also sort of a paradoxical thing, because on the one hand, one of the reasons for the historic wealth gap between African Americans and white families is because white families could benefit from rising real estate values when they bought a house and stayed in it for a long time. Black families could not in so many neighborhoods. Now we see rising values in some black neighborhoods, and it's both positive for some people, but it also is upsetting the kind of social balance of the city, or it feels like it's keeping people from living where they ought to be able to live somehow. But you're working on a documentary film about gentrification, Mark. What's your take on that, or what have you learned from that relates to this?
My research, I found that we're growing as a city. I don't think anyone can deny that. We're bringing a lot of people, tech companies, the film industry, things like that. At the same time as we're growing, we've been known as the Black Mecca, but our Black population continues to shrink. And we get development projects like the Beltline, which is, good for business, and it even raises home values sometimes, but at the same time, some people can't afford to live where they do anymore. And then we have affordable housing, which I think is a good first step, and I'm seeing a lot more companies be intentional about it and inclusive of this affordable housing. But at the same time, as you mentioned, that wealth gap, and I'd have to fact check these numbers, but I think the average white family income is like $83,000, and for Black families, it's like $28,000. I believe those are the numbers I saw. And so when you kind of compile that all together, it's like we are this great city. We are the Black Mecca. We've done, whether you believe it or not, that's one of our nicknames. And so we do have this history of being at the forefront of all these social movements, but at the same time, I wonder, is our identity or our culture changing as we develop? And is there a way that we hold on to that, but also grow as a city? So that's for anyone, doesn't have to be just for you.
I think the education component is key. So when you talk about how our city is changing, it's absolutely changing. And that's why it's incumbent upon us as elected officials to make sure that we are educating folk about what this means for our communities and what this means for generations of families if you are able to hold on to property, because it's not common in our community.
I think it's great that you're even making a documentary
Yes.
about that. As a 20-year-old, not many 20-year-olds are thinking about gentrification and what
Absolutely.
that means. So maybe it's possible so many of your peers, you may be able to educate them, for them to start the home ownership process sooner, because they see the value in leaving an inheritance to your children's children. And I think it's great. I think you should definitely continue, educating everyone about what that is.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest things that we wanted to focus on when starting this project was that I found there's almost different working definitions of the word gentrification. And what I mean by that is some people mean, of course, displacement of people, oftentimes minorities, but then other people are talking about revitalizing an area. And so a lot of pushback I hear from people will say, well, this area was blighted, you know, it's crime ridden, this, that, and the other. Now look, it's doing great, you know. And I think the definitions aren't exactly matching up. And so there's that disconnect because, you know, someone else is talking about, well, yeah, it's great. The community's doing great. The people aren't in the community anymore. So, you know, it's not the same community. And it's the one thing I could say, if I could sum it up all in one, it would just say it's not just like a micro level issue. There's so many different factors and considerations going on. Like I don't in my heart believe most companies just find an area and say, okay, we're going to gentrify this. It just kind of happens. And, you know, with the neoliberal market structure, the money's going to guide an area. And so they will invest in this, and then people will sell their homes. And it's just a lot of different complicated issues. So that's the best way I could sum it up.
Well, I echo what Kim said. That is great that you are doing a documentary on this because it's so important to our city and cities across America. There were a group of young men in City Hall one day, and I asked them what they thought about how Atlanta was changing. And it was interesting getting their responses. One young man said, you know, it makes me really sad because my family is having to move out. You know, my uncle used to live down the street and they raised his rent and he had to leave, so my neighborhood's changing. And then another young man said, it's, you know, in ways it's cool because I'm being exposed to people that I otherwise wouldn't talk to. And he gave this example. He said, my next door neighbor is a white guy and I talk to him all the time and I realize all white people aren't bad, because that had not been his experience. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be a dirty word. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's awful when the communities get pushed out, but it's a beautiful thing if the communities can stay a part of the revitalization. So I look forward to seeing your documentary.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
Kim lives in Buckhead, and there's some folks in Buckhead who say that they're not a group of white people, but who are saying that they think Buckhead ought to split away and become its own city. Mm-hmm. Is that a kind of white flight, no matter what people say? Is it just now it's a kind of white flight of people abandoning the city and trying to take some of the city with them? How do we have a city in which there isn't a constituency for those kinds of ideas?
Well, I think that the better use of energy would be for us to work together and see how we can address the concerns. It's not a new idea. Buckhead has long threatened to leave Atlanta, but what's new is that it's made some progress this time. Interestingly enough, the word are being carried by two men who don't even live in Atlanta. But the concerns are real. Crime is an issue, and we talked about it. It's an issue here. It's an issue across the country right now. It's what I describe as the COVID crime wave. Mm-hmm. This post-COVID, post-trauma of what we witnessed over the past year with Black men and police brutality. There are a lot of issues that are playing out in our streets right now, but I don't know how creating a new city addresses those issues. Unless you build a wall around that city and lock everyone in their homes, which, by the way, still wouldn't help, because a lot of the crime that we are experiencing are between people who know one another. You aren't going to be able to remove yourselves physically from what's happening around the country right now. But I hear the concerns, I hear the frustration, and it's no different because people on the South Side in Southwest Atlanta, where I live, are equally concerned and want to make it home safely and want to be free of crime. So it's an issue that we are tackling head on, city-wide, and I hope that our energy will continue to be to address this issue together. We're expanding our camera network in the city. We're putting more officers on the streets. But we've also got to address the systemic issues that are leading people to crime. We've got to address the mental health issues that we will see many, many more post-COVID, which is why we are creating At Promise Youth Centers for our kids, giving them an opportunity to get resources in our communities. We're in so many other things that we've seen that's worked in other cities. We've got to do it all together.
Yeah, I've been a resident of Buckhead, like I said, at least the last 15 years. And like you just said, it was during COVID to where the crime just peaked uncontrollably. I'm assuming maybe more so they knew Georgia was open, maybe where they live was not. They came here to do what they would normally do there. And being a resident, normally I wouldn't think twice about going to Lenox to grab whatever, but now I have to think twice about it. What day is it? What time is it? And I think it's important, you know, for all those things that you just mentioned to go into place because, you know, I purposely chose to have my children in Buckhead because, you know, that's where I wanted them to be. And I work in the media industry. I need to be centrally located for film and television and interviews and those type of things. But then if crime continues, then I have to totally reconsider because, you know, I want my family to be safe. So I'm looking forward to see what those changes will be, especially in Buckhead, because the spike is just, it's just amazing. It was unfortunate, the young lady, the little girl that got killed, just riding in a car, passing Phipps Plaza, and it turns out the person that committed the crime wasn't even a resident of Georgia. He lived in another state, and he had, you know, other charges against him as well. So again, that went back to the pandemic, but I'm looking forward to what those changes need to be in order to get Buckhead and all cities in Georgia back to where that has this issue, back to where it needs to be.
Yeah, and that was the absolute worst that could possibly happen. And to have it happen at Christmas time,
Yeah,
it's absolutely terrible. And it is, you know, at the end of the day, whether I'm mayor or not, I'm raising a family here. So I care about this city deeply, and it goes beyond my being mayor. It's because this is my home, and this is where I walk out the door. My mother goes out, and my husband and children and my family. So I care about this issue and making sure that we address it in a real way and in a responsible way. The thought of another child dying in this city is not one that any of us want to have to think about.
But looking back over the last 4 years, is there anything you really regret? Is there a big mistake that you made or something you ignored that now you wish you hadn't? Or is there anything like that?
I try not to live with regrets, but if I could do things differently, I don't think I would have gone into this term with the rose-colored glasses that I walked in with, thinking that issues of corruption were, you know, that they weren't as big as they clearly were. I would have made changes sooner. I asked for everyone's resignation on 100 days, about 100 days in. I would have done that sooner. So I would have started my term differently. But that being said, with all that we face, the big corruption scandal into the previous administration, the cyber attack 3 months into my term that took all the systems down, the social justice movement we've talked about, and COVID. We may have stumbled at times, but we didn't fall. And that's what I'm grateful for.
That's a pretty honest answer. That's a more self-aware answer than I think most public figures would give. The last thing I want to ask you about is that this is going to be an election year. Atlanta elections for mayor in recent times have been really closely contested ones. And hard to say what will happen this year, but you do have a long-term city council figure who is running against you. Sharon Gay, a white attorney, well-known in Democratic circles and legal circles, also saying she's going to run. Other names are coming out. Interesting to see exactly how those dynamics will play out. But leaving aside the specifics of the politics of that, when you give up your seat as mayor, but what's the city that you want to give to the next person? What does it look like? And the one specific thing I'll add to that is that your friends in the White House, President Biden and Vice President Harris, are really going big right now. And are effectively going big. Much more effectively, really, than at the beginning of the Obama administration. That's one of the big criticisms of that one can explore about that administration. They're going big, and one could argue that the mayor of Atlanta right now, with a city that's so prosperous, even with all the difficulties that have been happening, but so prosperous that it's time for taxes to go up, or at least in certain respects. It's time for parks to be funded and recreational facilities. It's time for to stop saying how can we do the right thing for homeless people or mentally ill people because we don't have enough money. That it's time to say no, we do. We're a wealthy, growing, booming city. Can you go big? What does big look like? But what does this city look like when you hand it to the next mayor?
Well, one, I hope that the next mayor will get a city hall that I thought that I was getting when I walked in. One where there are solid leaders in place, ethical leaders, leading with integrity and honesty, because that can consume a lot of energy when you are spending time on responding to a federal investigation. That's inside City Hall. But outside of City Hall, I want this city to be truly that beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And it's very ambitious, but it's doable. This city free of poverty, a city that is free of hatred, a city that's free of prejudice. And what that means is there've got to be people from all walks of life who can afford to live in this city with dignity. That's why the affordable housing piece is so big, and that's why your work is so important. I want this city to be the city that it was for me as a child, that allowed me to believe as an African-American girl growing up in this city, who was visiting her father in prison, that anything was still possible, and that I could believe that one day my life would be better than my circumstances, and that I could become mayor of this city. That is the city that we have the responsibility to leave to future generations. And, I still want to be able to walk down the street and walk in the grocery store with my head held high and still be able to call Atlanta home without fear and without shame.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
There was last summer, there was a pandemic, there was a social justice movement. There was a madman in the White House. And at every turn and every opportunity, this city rose above, and I am so proud of that.